Okay, so in the previous video, we took a look at sort of introduction to arrays. In this next video, we're going to go ahead and recreate this setup for assigning values to the array and then printing out the contents by allowing the user to provide their own input for each value in this array. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create a new program. We're going to go ahead and close this array demo. And this new program or new project, if you're doing this from an IDE, we're going to go ahead and call this one array input. This will be a Java file. And we'll go ahead and get our class header set up. So we'll have public class array input. We'll have our main method, so public static void main. And then inside of this, what I want to go ahead and do is set up a scanner and be able to use that scanner to allow the user to provide some input about what values to put into this array. So coming up here, I'm going to do an import, do java.util.scanner, and then we'll go ahead and make a scanner object. We'll call it keyboard. It's going to be equal to a new scanner, which we use to read from our standard input. So we'll do system.in. We can also go ahead and create our array. So we're going to have an integer array. We'll call this, we'll use the same convention that I used for the demo. So we'll just call this numbers. And for this one, since we're going to let the user specify their own values, we're not going to use that pair of curly braces or try to initialize the individual values for this array on declaration. Instead, we're just going to go ahead and make a new array object and specify the size here. So I have a new int array. And we'll go ahead and give this a size of, let's say, 5 right now. Okay. And then the next thing we want to go ahead and do is create a for loop that allows the user to specify a value, and we're going to assign that value to a particular location in this array. And the reason I'm going to use a for loop for this is because of the fact that as we provide each one of these values, we're just going to step through each position or each location of that array. So go ahead and write the initial setup for our for loops. We're going to say for. We're going to use that integer index, which starts from 0, since we want to start from the 0th position of the array. We're going to keep going for as long as it's less than this 5, the size of the array. So I say index less than 5. And we're going to be incrementing the value of index as we step through each location. So we're going to do index plus plus. We'll then go ahead and have a pair of curly braces for this for loop, since I do have 2 lines that I need to include here. The first one is going to be a print statement asking the user to specify a value. So we'll say please enter a value to insert into the array. Let's just do a print statement, since the user will have to push enter anyway when they specify a value. And then on the next line, we want to go ahead and take the numbers array, and we're going to specify the position as index, since we're just going to be incrementing through this and changing the value of index each time. And this is going to be equal to the next integer that they provide. So we're going to do keyboard dot next int. Okay. And then once they've done all that, then we can go ahead and also print out the values that are in this array. So we'll then go ahead and have a second for loop, again using int index, which starts from 0. Say index less than 5, and then we'll do index plus plus, just increment through it. And for this one, we'll do system.out.println. And we can use pretty much the same statement as before, so we'll just say at position plus our index. And then we'll add in that colon and a space. And then we'll also show the value at that particular index at the end of this. So we'll say numbers index. Okay. So again, we're just setting up the scanner, making a new array whose size is 5. We're going to be using that size to control how many iterations we'll do for each of these for loops. We're starting from 0, since that's the initial position in our array. For this first for loop, we're just going to be asking the user to provide these 5 values that we want to insert into the array. And then on this one, we're just going to go ahead and print out each of those 5 values that they gave us. Okay. So we'll then come over to our terminal and clear all of this. Go ahead and compile array input.java. And then go ahead and run it. And then we'll get this little message here asking the user to enter a value to insert into the array. So we'll go ahead and just input 5 different values. So I'm just going to pick a couple of numbers, do 4, 7, 3, 2, and 8. And then at the very end, it'll just go ahead and print out the values that we put in. So we got our 4 at position 0, we have our 7 at position 1, we have our 3 over here at position 2, we have this 2 at position 3, and we've got this 8 at position 4. Okay. So this shows us about half of the kind of input that we can provide as far as arrays go. There's actually one other thing that I also want to be able to include, which has to do with the fact that we've allowed the user to specify the individual values that we want to put into the array, but we might also want to allow the user to specify how many values they want to put in the array in the first place. That is to say, maybe we should give them some control over this size that we specified here. So to do that, we want to go ahead and introduce another request from the user to ask for a size. So we're going to say something like system.out.println, and we'll say, please specify the size of the array. And again, this should just be a print statement since the user has to push the enter key anyway. And then on the line underneath that, when we go to construct our object, our array object, instead of putting the value 5, we're instead just going to put the next int. So we're going to say keyboard.nextInt. Okay. And it's important to make sure that when they specify the size that is an integer, since obviously we couldn't use any other, say like a decimal value, since this is supposed to determine how many positions we have. And you know, if the user puts something like 2.5, you can't exactly have half of a position in an array. So it needs to be a whole number of some kind. Okay. So then the next point though is that now we've got these values 5 for each of these arrays. So we need to replace this with something else so that we can keep track in a sort of dynamic way of what the size of the array happens to be based on what value the user gave us. So there's actually a very useful property with arrays that we can make use out of here. There's a field that's provided with the array class, which is the length field, which will keep track of the size of the array for us. So if you do numbers, we can then do a dot notation, and then we can access the length field. And we'll go ahead and do that for each of these. And for those of you that are particularly aware of what's going on here, you might be wondering why it is that I'm accessing this length field of a class when previously when we had discussed in that sort of introduction to objects and classes that typically your fields are supposed to be private. So you might be wondering why is it that length is not private? Well, the reason for that is because of the fact that length is actually a final variable, meaning that the moment that we create this array, so we specified it right here, that size is pretty much set. The only way that you could possibly change that is by just making an entirely new array with a new size. So because of that, there's no way to modify this length variable, meaning that it was basically decided that because we can't modify it because it's final, that it's pretty safe to just go ahead and allow the user to have direct access to it. So we're going to access this length field. We'll go ahead and save this. And so now when we do this, we're going to specify the size and then specify some items or some elements that we want to put into it. So we'll come over here. We'll compile this. We'll then run it. So first we'll specify the size of the array. So let's say now instead of a size of 5, I want to make this maybe a little bit smaller and just do a size of 3. So do that. And then we'll go ahead and insert some values into the array. So we can do something kind of like, say, maybe a 6, a 1, and a 9. And then it will print out at position 0, 1, and 2. We have the values 6, 1, and 9. Okay. So this shows us the general setup if we want to be able to use user input to do both the size and the individual elements of the array, and also getting some usage out of that length field. for the array.